With the PlayStation 5 officially being a thing and out in the wild, and the PlayStation 4 being well into the twilight of its life, I think it's high time we start talking about some of the many games that slipped through the cracks of the mainstream despite being pretty good. With all of the fanfare surrounding big AAA PS4 classics like God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn, you couldn't be blamed for missing some games, as they never really grabbed headlines the way the bigger games did. But that's where I come in. For some reason, I've always been drawn to the underappreciated, so naturally I enjoy bringing them up in hopes that more people can enjoy them. So here's some great PS4 games that you might have missed. Rad Rodgers is a game that I passed up on when it came out, and I feel like that was a mistake. I guess I just assumed it was a bit too generic looking, and it does sort of give off that vibe, I suppose, but there's actually quite a bit of soul in this game that a lot of other throwback platformers simply don't have. At its core, it's a fairly simple platforming run and gun. Not a lot of frills, light on gimmicks, and I really love it for its simplicity. These days, it seems like a lot of modern side-scrolling games lean too heavily on having gimmicks to stand out from the herd, but Rad Rodgers revels in being a straightforward experience that you could easily see yourself playing 20 years ago. There's some platforming, some shooting, and you do a little exploration to find exit chunks to unlock the exit for each level, and that's about it. It's refreshingly uncomplicated, and a very deliberate 90s throwback with its story, as the main character is a typical 90s kid who loves video games and gets pissed off when his mother tells him to turn off his toy and go to bed. The game glitches out, he gets sucked into it, and boom, you got a game. The voice acting is also really good across the board, with some solid, albeit adolescent humor.
Hey kid, ever tried crystal just crystal? Here, on me! The first try is always free.
And characters that end up being way more interesting than they would have been with a lesser cast. Rad is mostly endearing, despite feeling like a low-rent Dash Par at times. And his game console buddy Dusty is just awesome as a sidekick. You even take control of Dusty in some overhead Pixelverse levels, where you just have to find things that are missing from the glitched-out game. And these sections are a bit clunky, but I appreciate how they mix up the experience. The combat is fun with multiple weapons and melee attacks from Dusty, and the platforming is good, although it can sometimes be a little difficult to tell exactly where the edges of some platforms are, and that can lead to the occasional cheap fall. This is a common issue for 2.5D platformers, and not that big of a deal, but I do feel like it should be mentioned.
Stick back in your slot and smoke it.
Overall, though, this is a great choice if you love the genre, especially if you miss the attitude of classics from the 90s like Earthworm Jim or Comic Zone.
Who you gonna call?
Rad Rodgers!
Jazzpunk is a one-of-a-kind game, to say the least. It's basically a semi-open world game that takes place in this bizarre world of traffic sign people come to life that essentially makes no sense, and you just run around and complete ridiculous missions. As far as I can tell, there is somewhat of a Cold War setting with Russian spies and some espionage and whatnot, but that's just a very loose backdrop and often gives way to the game's many deviations from that, with totally bizarre and always hilarious interactions with characters and even some inanimate objects. It's absurd, and I love it. It's a really funny game that actually has me laughing out loud all the time. If you enjoy the humor style of Mel Brooks movies or old-school Adult Swim cartoons, then you will almost certainly like this too. It's got tons of little details, like boxes and trees talking to you and silly, unnecessary animations that are just everywhere. So even though the comedy is its best quality, I also really appreciate the game design as a whole. It's quite dense with things to see and do. Totally worth a buy if you like artistic experimental games or absurdist humor. Luckily for me, I like both, so Jazzpunk easily achieves hidden gem status for me.
Don't take too many. If you need me, I'll be in the wine cellar.
Nex Machina is a game I can't really praise enough. Housemarque is one of my favorite developers and really made a name for themselves on the PS3. They continue to outdo themselves on the PS4 though, with games like the excellent Resogun, but I think I actually like this game a little better than that one. It applies all of the things I liked about Resogun, but while that game was a spiritual successor to Defender, Nex Machina puts all of that saturated neon and particle effect goodness into a Robotron-style game. And it's really just an incredible package. Rescuing humans, secret areas, fun weapons, and some really intense boss battles are all here. If you liked Super Stardust, Resogun, or any of the other arcade-style twin-stick shooters out there, you really need to play this one. I'm surprised that it never got as popular as Resogun, but I suppose that also gives me an excuse to mention it here. And it gives me really high hopes for Returnal on the PS5. Slain Back from Hell is a game that I went back and forth on for this list, as it certainly has its strong points, but honestly I think it's just a little too rough around the edges. I mean, I think it's a perfectly good game, it's there if you want it, but I wouldn't quite call it a gem. Thankfully, the developer of Slain more recently came back with an even better game with Valfaris, which is demonstrably better than Slain in basically every way. Yet, sadly, it seems even less popular. It follows Slain's early 32-bit era aesthetic with a run-and-gun shooter. The challenge Slain was known for is still here, but it feels more earned this time around. It's hard, but rarely feels out of reach, so it has a way of keeping you playing regardless of how good, or in my case bad, you are. The weird, loud color palette sets it apart from other games a bit, and it even seems like there's a few drops of H.R. Geiger mixed in, which I always enjoy. Valfaris has great enemy variety, cool levels, fun weapons, and furious combat. The only gripe I have with it is that you spend the same currency on checkpoints and weapon upgrades, making you choose between them a lot of the time, meaning you will feel underpowered later on if you play conservatively with lots of checkpoints, but if you do keep your weapons upgraded, you'll end up having to play long stretches over and over again when you do inevitably die. So I'm not really in love with that system, especially considering that the game is already quite challenging as it is. But with that being my only gripe, this is a highly recommendable 2D run-and-gun platformer that has plenty of challenge, a cool look, and totally unique atmosphere, backed up with an insanely awesome, gravelly doom metal soundtrack, unlike anything you'll hear in pretty much any other game these days. Or ever. I always enjoy a good tower defense game, and X-Morph Defense is definitely one of my favorites. The PS4 doesn't have many of them, but thankfully it does have a few, and this is one of the best. It's got a neat setting where you actually control the alien invaders who are trying to secure various locations on Earth to extract resources, and of course dominate the planet. So the spots that are chosen are strategically relevant to the areas, and must be defended from the human military. I like that take on it, as it's normally the other way around. You have upgradable towers, unlockable weapons, and even some passive abilities for the core to defend itself in a pinch. But the big thing that sets this one apart is that you also control a ship in real time that plays like a twin-stick shooter to help your towers out as they get overwhelmed. The ship has its own upgrades and weapon options, so it's actually pretty deep once you get into it. There's a lot of levels with a lot of variety, survival modes, and even a co-op mode, which you don't see every day in a game like this. Definitely worth a pickup if you're into the genre.
We were able to evacuate the plans and parts for Project Defender that can finally stop the aliens.
Senran Kagura Peach Beach Splash is a spin-off of the main Senran Kagura series, but honestly I think I like this just as much as anything in the main series all in all. Where the other games are Musou-style hack-and-slashes, this is more of an arena shooter, kinda like Quake, but with water guns and anime girls. It's definitely a Senran game, and everything that you would expect from one of those games is here. At first, it seems like a pretty thin game, but once you unlock some weapons and some passive abilities, there's actually quite a lot to experiment with, and it keeps things from getting stale much more effectively than other Senran games in my honest opinion, and I like it a lot for that. I think because this is technically a spin-off of an already niche main series with a different gameplay style, it doesn't really get mentioned much at all, and that's a shame. It really deserves more recognition than it gets. The story and characters are all very asinine, which is normal for the series, but the gameplay is solid. So if the somewhat pervy elements of the series don't bother you, or if that's something you're looking for, not judging, I'd definitely give this one a try. Another action game with a fan-servicey twist is Onechanbara Z2 Chaos. Now, to be honest, I'm pretty out of the loop on the story with this series, so I don't know a lot about it other than the fact that this is the most recent one, chronologically speaking. The series got started in the PS2 era and has been pretty scattered across multiple generations and multiple platforms and multiple regions since then, and I just haven't really felt bothered enough to really dig into the lore because of that, but thankfully I don't think it really matters too much. The world is infested with zombies and monsters, and these ladies are the only ones who can do anything about it. There you go. It's published by the same folks who put out the Earth Defense Force games, which is a good indicator for me, and should come as no surprise once you realize how over-the-top crazy the action is. Think Senran Kagura, but mixed in with a little Devil May Cry, and you basically get this. Also maybe a dash of Lollipop Chainsaw. But I wouldn't recommend this game if all it had was visual style. Rest assured, this is a really good action game that doesn't get in its own way with a convoluted story or needlessly complicated controls. It's very comfortable being a pick-up-and-play action game, but at the same time, certain enemies and bosses require you to learn when to dodge and can only be defeated in certain ways. So it's not as mindless as it might seem at first glance. There's also a ton of extra weapons and moves to unlock for all 4 playable characters, which all play pretty distinctly differently, have their own movesets and their own weapons, and you can switch between them at pretty much any time. There's enough stuff to unlock here that I didn't even really get much of it with my one playthrough, so you'll want to play through it at least a couple of times, I think, to see everything. I rather like this weapon here, the Barbarian Blades, since they're a pretty clear nod to God of War. This is the type of action game that seems to have died out a little bit in recent years, but I'll always defend this type of thing. It beats you over the head with eye candy and crazy visual feedback at every turn, and also has really good gameplay to back it up. Plus, you fight against a giant pair of legs on a cruise ship. So, yeah. THUMPER is straight up one of my favorite games of all time, let alone on the PS4. The developer describes it as a rhythm violence game, and yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. You could also describe it as Amplitude meets the worst acid trip of all time. Your beetle races down the track at ridiculous speeds while avoiding spikes, grinding on walls, and hitting these white buttons on beats, which is harder than it would be in a typical rhythm game, as the music here is often in weird time signatures and has lots of offbeat accents that can be hard to predict with normal sensibilities. If you've ever listened to King Crimson or Tool or Dream Theater, then you might be able to get into that headspace a little bit easier than the average person, but the offbeat music becomes part of the challenge, and I find that to be an interesting wrinkle in all of this. The beetle has a shield that can only take one hit, so maintaining concentration with the progressive industrial music and not letting the nightmarish, unnerving visuals throw you off is probably the game's central challenge. Losing that shield ratchets up the tension even more, as the game makes you feel like you're constantly on the razor's edge, always within 1 or 2 milliseconds of complete destruction. This makes getting through a tough section without a shield, then getting it back at the next checkpoint, just as satisfying as never losing it in the first place. Each stage is made up of many sub-stages and a couple of boss battles, which require you to make perfect runs of certain sections to manifest a hit to the boss. Each boss takes a handful of hits, then, boom, on to the next godforsaken tripped-out hellscape. It's a game that gets tough quick and rarely lets up, but it is fair and extremely addicting. I find myself replaying levels a lot to get better scores, despite feeling like my spirit was brutally assaulted by the god of DMT by the end of them. It's not every day that a game is able to give my mind such an intense sense of relief after being out of a level, yet also match that with just as intense a desire to jump back into it. Later levels require intense concentration that put you in a flow state unlike anything any other game has ever put me in. If you like rhythm games, offbeat weird games, or if you're like me and enjoy both, then definitely grab this immediately. I'd really like to see a follow-up to this one day. With there being so many great games on the PS4, no one Hidden Gems video could even begin to cover them all, so I'll probably have to do another one eventually, right? And I'm always on the lookout for more underappreciated great games like this, so feel free to let me know if there's something that I missed or something I should look into for the next one. And until then, thanks for watching.